And hello, friends. We welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm your host, Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us on the program today. We're talking about songwriting, and we're talking about songwriting in contemporary West Virginia with musicology professor and author Travis Stimeling. And Travis joins us today. He's the Associate Professor of Musicology at West Virginia University, where he also directs the WVU Bluegrass and Old Time Bands. His previous books include Cosmic Cowboys and New Hicks, the countercultural sounds of Austin's progressive country music scene, and the Country Music Reader, and also 50 Cents and a Box Top, the creative life of Nashville session musician Charlie McCoy, which was also published by WVU Press. And we're pleased and glad to have Travis with us today to talk about his new book. So, Travis, welcome to Chapters. Good to have you here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, let me ask you first before we get into your book, musicology. Mm-hmm. For our audience that may not be familiar with that term or what that is, lay some groundwork for us about what musicology actually is.
Well, essentially, the way I define it is musicology is a fancier word for music history, or sometimes I describe myself as an ethnomusicologist, somebody who's interested in the ways that music works in culture, and the ways that people live music and live musical lives. So the work that I do a lot of work with oral histories and talking to musicians and working with musicians all around the South and in West Virginia particularly, to learn how they make music, to learn why they make music, and to learn a little bit more about the value that those communities place on the music that they make.
What got you interested in musicology or in studying music and being involved with music?
So I was a music major when I was in college. I grew up playing music, to be perfectly honest. My earliest musical experiences were listening to Willie Nelson and Ted Nugent, Van Halen. And I grew up singing bluegrass gospel music with my mom back home in Upshur County. I used to sing the leads, I would sing the high tenor, Mom would sing the lead. And then when my voice broke, we switched parts. And so I grew up playing that kind of music, but I was in the high school band. I went on to study music at West Virginia Wesleyan. I was a low brass major there. And as I was preparing my senior recital, I realized I spent more time in the library than I did in the practice room. And I thought, there's probably something here that is a sign that I should probably pursue something else. And so musicology captured my attention, and I went on to WVU to do a master's degree there, and then to the University of North Carolina to do a PhD. Now almost 11 years ago I finished that.
That's great. Fantastic. Yeah. So your book, Songwriting in Contemporary West Virginia, Profiles and Reflections, 6 different parts. Mm-hmm. You kind of take us into different parts of the state, different regions of the area. How did you determine or come up with the songwriters and the singers that you wanted to put in this book? What was that process like?
So there were a few songwriters I knew immediately that I wanted to have in the book, and honestly most of those were people associated with the Mountain Stage program on West Virginia Public Broadcasting. I knew of Larry Gross, I knew of Todd Burs, who's played on the program a lot and who's now been a guest host on it. From there, I went online to CD Baby and did a search. You can do a geographic search for artists, and I did a search for musicians, songwriters from West Virginia, and then got a hold of as much material as I could, started interviewing those folks, and then they turned me on to even more people. And so over the course of a couple of years, I ended up meeting close to 30 songwriters working in a lot of different styles all over the state. And got to make music with some of them. I've actually produced albums with a couple of them and played concerts with them. Really just gotten to know them both in terms of their own history, but also kind of knowing their creativity from the inside.
Very good. Yeah. That's really interesting. How long did that take from the time you started interviewing them, I imagine, and coming up with a transcript or something written of what they said, and thinking about what am I going to keep, what am I going to get rid of, what am I going to put in the collection, based on what they've told me. How long was that process? What was that process
That
like?
whole process took a couple of years. I mean, the interviews were very intensive for about a little over 2 year period, which partly that was mostly traveling, just trying to find time in the schedule to go to all the different corners of the state. Living in Morgantown, it's sometimes hard to get around to any place that's not Morgantown, and so that took a lot of time. Then I transcribed the interviews. I actually had student workers help me with that, so they learned a lot about West Virginia music in the process. And then, shape these into narratives. So they're interview based narratives. They're not just a straight transcript of the interview, but I try to make some sense out of the conversation. In part because oral history isn't always linear. I always start an interview by saying, "Tell me about the music you grew up with." But sometimes that takes us immediately to the present, and so we have to kind of spend our conversation looping around back through time. And so I tried my best to shape it in a kind of linear chronological narrative in the book.
Very good. I want to ask you about a couple of people that you profile in the book that really caught my attention. Mike Pushkin is the first one that caught my attention. I just want to read what you tell us about him in terms of, and I think this will tie into what you were saying about sort of the narrative and the narrative history of these individuals. Page 60, you talk about Mike Pushkin, and you say, for this Charleston native who serves as the 37th District Representative in the West Virginia House of Delegates, you write, yet politics was, until quite recently, was far from the mind of this bowling alley managing, cab driving, songwriting legislator. Rather, as a musician performing in several of West Virginia's most celebrated bands of the past 2 decades, Pushkin has been a leader in the West Virginia music scene who explores the intersections of rock, soul, reggae, and folk. 4 very different genres of music. Tell us a little bit about Mike Pushkin. I found his story was really interesting because of those 4 genres that he kind of specializes in, but also his life, everything he's done in his life. Tell us a little bit about Mike Pushkin.
Absolutely. Well, Mike Pushkin is to me, he's a real hero. I love watching him on the floor of the legislature. He's always kind of a thorn in the side of the status quo. I appreciate that about him. I came to know him after the big chemical spill in Charleston. He had written a song. The song was called "We're All a Bunch of Water." He was profiled in a number of kind of high-profile venues. I think the New York Times covered him. And so I was interested in finding out more about this guy who I thought was just a folk singer-songwriter. I had no idea there was the rest of this background. But it turns out that he grew up playing in kind of ad hoc rock bands, garage bands and things like a lot of musicians in their teens do, and found his way to WVU, which in the 90s was just a thriving live music scene, and kind of worked his way through a number of different bands there, playing to, my understanding is, playing to whatever styles audiences would come to. And so he found a way to write songs in a lot of different styles, which meant that he learned a lot about the nuances of those styles so that he could present them well. He's a terribly fascinating musician who still, despite being a full-time a legislator who is working really tirelessly on behalf of his constituents, he still plays regularly and writes new songs and things, and tries to tell the stories of the people in his community through those songs. It's something that I think not only does Mike do, but a lot of the songwriters in this book do, that they really focus on their immediate community and try to tell us, to help us understand what's going on in their neighborhoods. And that to me is a very powerful tool, right? To be able to use songs and create memorable lines and melodies that allow us to understand people in different ways.
Is it rare for a songwriter, and this might be more of a general musicology question other than what's in the book, to have those 4 different genres like Mike has, going from folk to reggae to, because I think about as writers, oftentimes writers say, well, I write fiction, or I write nonfiction, or I write romance, or I write memoir. Is that unique or not unique when you look at people like this and profile these people to say, hey, I cover all the spectrums of music genre? Is that rare, or is that pretty common?
It's pretty common. One of the things about in order to be a successful musician, even on a local level, you have to know a lot of different styles, because you never know what the audience is going to want. If you're playing a songwriter set at a restaurant somewhere, there's potentially good tip money in being able to play a Deep Purple cover, and so sometimes having that deep catalog of material in your back pocket can be very helpful to you. And a lot of the songwriters that I profile in the book come up through the church, lots of different church traditions. They come from bluegrass and old time music, but they write the blues. there's one songwriter who's in the book, Patrick Stanley, who's from here in the Huntington area. That one of his favorite bands is Oasis, but he writes music that sounds like it could be, Waylon Jennings inspired. So, I think that what's really fascinating is all of the different threads coming together as kind of potential vocabularies for these songwriters to work in, and they can choose what's most suitable to the story that they're working with, or to communicate with the audience.
Very good. I thought it's fascinating to know that about that, because it's different and similar to what writers do when they specialize in a genre. Another songwriter I wanted to ask you about, and singer, you mentioned him a moment ago, Todd Burs, who I've seen at Mountain Stage. You talked about him performing at Mountain Stage, and I love when you write this about him on page 87. Armed with an acoustic guitar, a ukulele, a harmonica, and a host of gizmos and gadgets, Burs can have you laughing about the antics of his deer dog one minute and then leave you weeping about his passing the next. And I can remember seeing him the first time several years ago at Mountain Stage, and it was like watching a juggler. I mean, he had all these different instruments, and he could just shift from one to the next, and play a fast-paced song with one, then take that away and put another one on and go slow. But I was amazed at that. It really was like watching sort of an acrobat do his thing. Tell us a little bit about him, because he's just really a fascinating person that you profile in your book.
One of the things I love about Todd is that he is able to build an entire life around music. He's one of the few people profiled in the book that makes all of his income from music. He has an Instagram channel, and he does Facebook Live videos. Every day he's out playing a new song on the for his audience. He writes songs on demand, which I think is a remarkable skill. That on Valentine's Day he'll take orders for songs because people like to get songs for for Valentine's Day, and he's found a way to make a living out of all of this. And his view on life, I mean, I hate to speak for him quite that directly, but I feel like there's a certain kind of irony in a lot of his lyrics that if you dig a little bit deeper, there's a lot of real sincere sentimentality there, that there's a kind of a veneer of irony that you have to push through to get to some deeper meaning. And Todd challenged me, actually, because everybody got to review their chapter in the book, and Todd challenged me on a couple of my interpretations. He says, "No, you're taking this ironically, and actually this is how I intended it." And I found that to be really, really interesting. But Todd came up through the kind of post-punk era, in the indie rock scene of the late 80s in the Morgantown area, again, kind of that thriving university scene that was happening there, and discovered in I guess the late 90s that acoustic music was more his thing, that so he put up the electric guitar and took up his acoustic guitar and his ukulele, and he writes just some remarkable songs. And again, I think he's a great example of how you can build a life around creative endeavor here in the state of West Virginia. That he's living in Parkersburg and able to build a full-time job around creativity.
You mentioned in your acknowledgments that there are 3 books that really helped you, or 3 songwriter interview books that you read that helped you with this book. And you mentioned Kathleen Hudson's Telling Stories, Writing Songs, an album of Texas songwriters. You mentioned Marshall Chapman's They Came to Nashville, and Julie Hight's Right by Her Roots. Yeah. How were those books helpful to you in coming up with a strategy or a method for interviewing and profiling these different songwriters?
Yeah, well, Kathleen Hudson's book, and she's done 2 books, but one in particular that you cited has been even more influential to me. She promoted Texas as kind of a site for songwriting. She said, one of the things that makes Texas special is that we have these great songwriters. And I said, well, here in West Virginia, we have great songwriters too, right? And so part of the motivation for the book was to kind of push back against Texas and its claim to have songwriting just completely covered, because I think we do a really good job there. What's interesting about all 3 of those books is that each of the authors spends a lot of time listening to the songs themselves. And tries to use the songs as a gateway into conversation. So sometimes a songwriter might not be terribly good at explaining themselves in long form, kind of like I'm struggling to speak here. I might be better in paragraph than I am in long-winded phrases. And so the song, which is kind of this distillation of a feeling or an experience, allows us to get back into that. And so I would spend a lot of time in my interviews asking, can you talk a little bit about how you came to write this song? What is it? What are you trying to say with it? Why did you choose this particular structure? And learned a lot of really interesting things that way. I talked to Colleen Anderson, who's a remarkable poet, about some of the rhythms of her lines, and kind of her decisions to put emphasis on certain words in order to drive the meaning home subtly but intensely. So those three books really did push me to go in that direction, rather than just a strict life and times kind of thing.
Very good. And we mentioned Colleen Anderson. You and I talked about her a little bit before we started taping. She's been on the program before. What's interesting about her, and we learned this about her in your book, is that even though she's lived here for such a long time, a lot of people know her. They've read her poetry. They've listened to her essays on NPR.
Yeah.
We forget that she's not from West Virginia.
Right.
That and you and I talked about, she has that song West Virginia, or that poem, West Virginia chose me.
Yeah.
She's just a fascinating person, and it's interesting to see how being a part of this area, this state, this culture really has influenced and shaped so much of what she sings and writes about.
Absolutely. She's one of these just absolutely remarkable human beings who I think there's nothing she can't do creatively. She's a talented graphic designer. She teaches origami workshops at Ghost Ranch. She's a poet that just sees things that no one else sees, and is one of the most modest people I've ever met. I came to know Colleen. She came into my attention after the chemical spill. Again, another songwriter who I became aware of through the chemical spill. She sang on the floor of the House of Delegates during a joint hearing about one of the Senate bills dealing with tank regulations. And I'm watching the hearings, and this woman stands up. She says, "My name's Colleen Anderson. I'm from Charleston, West Virginia, and I'm going to give my comment the only way I know how." And she sings this song, "If you love my West Virginia, you will keep her waters clean. If you love my West Virginia." I mean, it was this just powerful moment. And I said, I need to know this person. And it turns out, she's been here since the 70s. She came as a Vista volunteer and helped to establish Cabin Creek Quilts, this wonderful collective of quilt makers that took quilts to market in New York and Chicago, all over the place, and then has just built this life here and writes so much wonderful material.
Yeah, she really is. When we talk about state treasures or state gems, I mean, she is one of them. She certainly is.
She is.
And of course, you talked about him too, and I know you profiled him deservedly so, Larry Gross, and what he has done. When I think about, certainly in my lifetime and maybe yours, when I think about 4 or 5 people that have influenced West Virginia in a positive way the most, I mean, he's definitely in the top 5. Tell us a little bit about him, and for some of our folks watching the audience, maybe you've heard of Mountain Stage, we don't really know exactly what that is. Tell us a little bit about that and the impact that Larry Gross has had on music in West Virginia.
So Larry Gross hosts a program called Mountain Stage. They describe it as live performance radio from the mountain state of West Virginia. And they bring in bands from all over the place that come here as a destination to have a live, unrestricted performance of their music. So Larry talks about making sure that the bands choose what songs they want to sing. A lot of programs will say, "We want you to come on, play your latest hits." Larry will say, "What do you want to play?" And so it gives musicians a chance to show off their particular talents. But Larry, in addition to hosting this program, is a prolific songwriter and recording artist. He was born in Texas, around a lot of those Texas songwriters Kathleen Hudson profiled, and came to West Virginia through a kind of circuitous path, but stayed here in part because of a National Endowment for the Arts position that allowed him to go into schools and teach songwriting to K-12 kids in Barber County and Tucker County. And that really rooted him here in West Virginia. That program, Mountain Stage, has become a major hub for a lot of songwriters. If you just look at the band, and they're profiled in the book too, Ron Soul, who's the band leader, another guy from the Southwest. He's from New Mexico, Roswell, but he followed Larry, not deliberately, all the way out here, became part of the Mountain Stage band. Julie Adams, who sings harmony on so many of those wonderful performances, she's a songwriter who's part of this. And a lot of the musicians in this book have either played on the program or aspire to play on Mountain Stage. That's a sign that you've really made it. And so Larry has played a really significant role in helping to brand West Virginia as a place where you can come to make the music that you want to make. And he does a good job of promoting West Virginia musicians, but it's not just about West Virginia music. It's about West Virginia for him.
Yeah, very good. Who, out of your book, who did you find the most interesting or fascinating person to profile?
Oh my goodness, they're going to be watching and they're going to hear. Now, I walked away from this experience deeply impressed with everyone, and that's going to sound like a bogus answer or a political answer, but this is a group of people who I dearly, I respect, I admire, I love a whole lot of them. There are a number that I've worked with here that I really do appreciate, probably just because our relationship's a little longer and a little deeper. For instance, I've been working with a musician named Clinton Collins. He's from down in the Bluefield area. Writes a lot of interesting songs in a lot of different styles. He can write a straight-ahead rockabilly number and then write a gospel song that would just take you right to the altar. We're actually working on producing an album together right now, and so that relationship has been important. Another musician, Doug Harper, who helped to start a songwriter circle at Tamarack, a low-stakes songwriter circle. It wasn't for people who necessarily had ever written before, but for people who wanted to write. And the idea was you come here and you share what you have, and we will be positive in our constructive criticism. I got to spend a lot of time with Doug. He just recently passed away, and he was getting his cancer treatments in Morgantown, right across the hill from me. And so I got to spend some time with him and learned a lot about what he valued and what was important to him. And he taught me a lot about living. I talked to him the day before he passed, and he was so excited for the next journey, and that experience meant so much to me. So this book, it's just full of people that are absolutely wonderful and beautiful, and some really dear friends.
I wanted to ask you about the overall scene of music in West Virginia. Where do you think we're headed? Maybe in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years out? Is this something that is going to be just as big a part of our culture as writing and as other types of art, visual art, or are we on an upswing, a downswing? Are we maintaining the status quo? Where do you see this going in the future?
Let me tell you, West Virginia is booming musically right now. All over the state of West Virginia, there are people who are getting bands together. There are jam sessions that are happening informally and formally. There are coffee shops and restaurants that are hosting open mic nights. If I've learned anything in this book recently, it's that I need to write a second one, because there are so many more musicians that I haven't had a chance to meet that I keep hearing about. I actually have kept a note on my phone so that when I do book events, I can take down names of people I need to interview. I think we're really on an upswing here. My biggest concern is that we will undervalue what it is that we have as a musical community, that we'll do things for free, that we will give away our music. And I think one of the things that's differentiated West Virginia from Nashville and from Texas is that we've always been willing to give it away. And I think if we can find a way to start building an economy around that, then we'll be able to keep it. And I think things are looking really good right now.
And I know in talking with you before we started taping as well, you've been away this past year from teaching at WVU.
Yeah.
You received a fellowship, and you're working on another book.
Yeah.
Tell us about the fellowship, and tell us what you're working on next.
So I've been very fortunate to have a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. This last year, they've allowed me a year off to write a book on Nashville session musicians from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I've been writing about all the folks who played with Jim Reeves and Patsy Cline, Little Jimmy Dickens, and George Jones, all the greats. And that's actually how I met Charlie McCoy, who I co-authored his autobiography that came out last year. So I've been off all this year writing that book. Hopefully, publisher will pick it up for very soon. It's a lot of fun to sit around listening to old country records for several hours every day and call it work,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I love all those people that you mentioned. I loved a lot of them, and I love Jim Reeves. I think we look back on the last 75 years of country music. I mean, to me, he's in the top in terms of having not only the great songs, but the great voice.
Absolutely.
I mean, his voice absolutely just mesmerizing. So glad to see he's going to be one of those profiled in your
book.
book.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm even more interested in the session musicians, the people who didn't get credit for playing on those recordings, because what's really interesting about those folks is that they could play on a Jim Reeves session at 10 in the morning, and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon they'd be doing something completely different, and that it was the same musicians bouncing from one studio to another, actually normally across the street from each other, and they could switch styles that much. There are musicians that are going to be in this book, like Harold Bradley, a guitar player, who you've heard every Christmas since the 1950s, because he played on Jingle Bell Rock, Rock Around the Christmas Tree, and Have a Holly Jolly Christmas. And he puts it on his resume. That's one of his proudest accomplishments, 2/3 of the way down the page. Played on the 3 greatest Christmas hits of all time. So whether you are a country music fan or not, you've heard these musicians just going grocery shopping at Christmas time.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the book. It sounds like it's going to be a great book when it gets released.
Well, thank you.
Travis, in our final moments with you today, if someone wants to get in contact with you to talk to you about music or about what you're working on, how can they do that? And then where can they get copies of your book, Songwriting in Contemporary West Virginia?
All right. Well, the best way to get a hold of me is to email me at WVU, travis.stimeling@mail.wvu.edu. I'm very responsive there. And the book you can purchase at any bookseller that you might be, or at least online booksellers you might be so inclined to buy at, or going to the WVU Press website. So there's a link there that one can go to purchase it. Of course, if you're in the Huntington area, I'd love you to come out to Empire Books, where there are copies available for sale today.
Absolutely. Very good. Travis Stimeling has been our guest here today on Chapters. We've been talking to him about his latest book, Songwriting in Contemporary West Virginia, Profiles and Reflections, a fantastic collection of some really amazing songwriters and musicians. Some of them you've probably heard of, some of them you may not have heard of, but all contributing to this wonderful, vibrant culture of songwriting and music in West Virginia. So, Travis, thanks for coming on. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much for having me.
We also want to take a moment to say thanks to Chris Dargish and the staff and management of Empire Books and News for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to Empire Books and pick up a copy of Travis's book, and we also remind you that many of the other author, editor, and publishers featured on our program have their works for sale right here at Empire Books and News. So come on down to Pullman Square and get a copy of whatever you're looking for to satisfy whatever reading taste you may have. That's right here at Empire Books and News, and we appreciate their sponsorship and support each and every episode here on Chapters. And one of the great features of our program is we make it possible for you to stay in contact with us and to reach out with us with questions, comments, or concerns about any Chapters programs that you've seen here on Armstrong Television. One of the ways you can get in touch with us is by the email address right here at the bottom of the screen, lp4@zoominternet.net. We do ask that you please write your name and the town or community in which you're writing from so that we can keep track of that correspondence. If you like to watch programming on YouTube, we have a Chapters tab through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen. When you put that into your search browser, just look for the Chapters tab, and we've got all of our author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you there as well. And if you're a Facebook user, we have a Chapters page on Facebook, and that is listed also here at the bottom of the screen. What we have on the Facebook page is our more recent interviews archived for you there. You can share those to your page, share those to groups that you may belong with, interact and comment with other viewers of the program, all that available to you through Facebook. So whatever social media platform you like to use, we've made it possible for you to reach out and stay in contact with us through social media. And we know many of you have done that, and we appreciate those comments and that feedback and that support so very much. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.